Now that I've discussed the general characteristics of fungi, what I'd like to do is introduce you to a couple of fungal diseases that I think you should be able to identify by eye. The first of these diseases is powdery mildew, and this particular disease is shown here on somewhat of an unusual plant and an unusual plant part. This is on African violet, and you notice all of this kind of white material that's growing on the flowers in this particular situation. Now, most of the time when you see powdery mildews, you're going to see them on leaves. For example, if you're out in your yard and you look at a lilac shrub, oftentimes we see powdery mildews, this white powdery material that grows on the surface of the leaves. But on this particular host, African violet, we tend to see the symptoms on the flowers. What's characteristic about powdery mildews is that they tend to produce a lot of growth along the surface of whatever plant part they're infecting, and a lot of that white material that you're seeing is actually asexually produced spores. Now, you may have noticed that I talked about powdery mildews in the plural. That's because there are lots and lots of different fungi that potentially can cause powdery mildew, and these particular fungi are relatively specific in terms of their host range. So we have one powdery mildew that can cause the disease on African violet. There's another powdery mildew fungus that causes the disease on lilacs, another powdery mildew that can potentially cause the disease on cucumbers and squashes and those sorts of plants. So again, we're talking about a large group of closely related organisms. They are all characterized by having this kind of whitish growth that occurs, again, primarily on the surface of the plant. They do penetrate into the epidermal layer of the tissue, so that's that outer layer of tissue of a leaf, or in this particular case, a flower. And they produce kind of an octopus-like structure called a haustorium, and it has these fingers on it that help absorb nutrients out of the plant. Most of the time, powdery mildews are relatively cosmetic diseases, but on occasion, on certain hosts, they can cause some leaf loss and cause leaves to dry up. In particular, I see a lot of problems on phlox. Also on bee balms or monardas, I see a lot of problems. Also, if you ever get powdery mildews on cucurbits, so squashes, pumpkins, cucumbers, that sort of thing, we can also see a lot of leaf drying due to powdery mildews as well. Part of what they do is as they're growing across the leaf surface or the flower surface, when they produce those haustoria, that opens up a small hole in the leaf surface that allows moisture to escape. And if you get enough of these infected areas on the leaf, that will cause a lot of dehydration, a lot of moisture loss, and that's what leads to the leaves drying up. In terms of management of powdery mildews, one of the best things that you can do if you've had a chronic problem in your yard is try to make sure you do good fall cleanup, because powdery mildews oftentimes overwinter in old plant debris, and so making sure you collect up all of the infested material that's died back in the wintertime and getting that out of your yard can reduce the amount of fungal spores that are likely to be produced the following year. Unfortunately, that does not totally take care of the problem, because many powdery mildew fungi will also overwinter not only in this plant debris, but they can also overwinter in overwintering buds on perennials. So they kind of hang out there, wait for the environmental conditions to be appropriate, and then they can reinfect a plant as it begins to sprout the following year. Now, in terms of environmental conditions, really the driving factor that will really get powdery mildews going is relative humidity. They're a little bit unusual compared to other types of fungal pathogens that will infect leaves and flowers, in that most of these other fungi really like wet leaf surfaces. They require what's called a leaf wetness period. So that's a length of time where there's actually a thin film of water on the leaves. But that's not what powdery mildews like. They like a dry leaf surface, but really, really high humidity around the leaf. And again, keep in mind that plants are their own mini humidity generators. They transpire, they naturally lose water through the leaves, and that creates a little humid cloud along the leaf surface. So one of the things that you need to do in order to manage powdery mildews is try to remove that humid air, and that's really a function of how much airflow is occurring around plants. So anything you can do to thin out plants, allow better airflow, will really help you in terms of clearing out that humid air and making it a less favorable environment for powdery mildews to occur. So thinning is important, or if you're establishing a new garden, make sure that you plant plants far apart so that you end up getting good airflow between the plants. Other things you can consider for control include use of resistant varieties. Certainly in phlox and rose, which can be hit pretty hard with powdery mildews as well, there are resistant varieties that are sold. And unfortunately, while you may get good disease control, these particular varieties may not have other horticultural characteristics that you're really interested in terms of flower color and that sort of thing. Also, if you're growing cucurbits, oftentimes they have been bred for resistance to powdery mildew, but again, the fruits that you get off these plants may not have the flavor that you want, but it's certainly an option. Other sorts of things that you can consider, there are fungicide treatments, and many of them, for controlling powdery mildews. As with most fungicide treatments, though, these applications need to be made before you see any symptoms, or in this particular case, it's what we call signs, where you see the actual fungus on the leaf or on the flower. You need to make these applications before you see any evidence of the disease in order for them to be effective. These fungicide treatments are really preventative treatments, not curative treatments. And while there are lots of commercial products that are available for powdery mildew control, what I normally recommend for most homeowners as a start is kind of a home remedy that's based off of some research that was done at Cornell University. What you do is you take 1.5 tablespoons of baking soda and 3 tablespoons of a lightweight horticultural oil. We'll come back to that in just a second. You mix that in a gallon of water, and again, you apply this as a preventative treatment. With any of these fungicide treatments, whether it's this baking soda concoction or the commercial products, you need to get good coverage. Cover the upper surface of the leaves, the lower surface of the leaves, the stems. Any part of the plant that potentially can become infected needs to be covered. Now, getting back to this baking soda concoction, I mentioned lightweight horticultural oil. There are many types of horticultural oil that are on the market. Most of them are overly heavy in terms of their weight for use for this particular application. Definitely, you do not want to use something like dormant oil. There's a reason it's called dormant oil. That particular oil is designed for use when plants are dormant. If you apply it to leaves, it will burn them. People have also tried to use motor oil, which is a great way to kill plants. Definitely, that's not a useful oil in this particular context. When we're talking about lightweight horticultural oil, we're really talking about a paraffin-based oil. In terms of when you apply these particular materials, what I normally do is, if you've gardened for a long time and have a good sense of when powdery mildews typically show up in your yard, then what I would suggest would be to go back about 3 weeks before that time point and start applications. Again, you want to apply these products preventatively. In my own garden, I usually start to see powdery mildews about the 1st of July, but again, that can vary from location to location. The other thing that you can do is make applications based on the relative humidity that you can monitor through your favorite weather site. When you start to see humidities that are roughly 60 to 70% that are being reported, that would be a point where the humidity along the leaf surface is probably getting pretty close to 100%, and that would be a great time to start applications. But again, with any sort of fungicide application, you really have to weigh the pros and cons of whether you want to do this. It does take a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, it can be somewhat expensive on occasion, and sometimes it's really better to forego the fungicide treatments and replace the plant with something else that's less prone to powdery mildews. And if you decide to go with a resistant variety, do keep in mind that resistance is not perfect. Even though you have a resistant variety, it will still come down with some powdery mildew. And the level of powdery mildew can really depend upon environmental conditions. I usually have a conversation at least once during a growing season with someone who comes in, usually bearing a powdery mildew resistant phlox plant, and kind of shakes it in my face and says, "Look at this plant. I bought it at the garden center. They told me it was resistant to powdery mildew, and look at all the powdery mildew on this particular plant." And what I have to explain to the person is that if that were a susceptible variety, it would look even worse. Sometimes, even when we have really conducive environmental conditions, if it's really muggy during the summer, even resistant varieties will have a fair amount of powdery mildew. Just keep that in mind as you're weighing your options for management for this particular disease.